Enabling VTP pruning. VTP pruning is not designed to function in VTP transparent mode. If one or more switches in the network are in VTP transparent mode, you should do one of these actions. Turn off VTP pruning in the entire network. Turn off VTP pruning by making all VLANs on the trunk of the switch upstream to the VTP transparent switch pruning ineligible. To configure VTP pruning on an interface, use the switch port trunk pruning VLAN interface configuration command. VTP pruning operates when an interface is trunking. You can set VLAN pruning eligibility, whether or not VTP pruning is enabled for the VTP domain, whether or not any given VLAN exists, and whether or not the interface is currently trunking. Enables pruning in the VTP administrative domain. By default, pruning is disabled. You need to enable pruning on only one switch in VTP server mode. Returns to privileged exec mode. Verifies your entries in the VTP pruning mode field of the display. VTP and Switch Stacks. VTP configuration is the same in all members of a switch stack. When the switch stack is in VTP server or client mode, all switches in the stack carry the same VTP configuration. When VTP mode is transparent, the stack is not taking part in VTP. When a switch joins the stack, it inherits the VTP and VLAN properties of the active switch. All VTP updates are carried across the stack. When VTP mode is changed in a switch in the stack, the other switches in the stack also change VTP mode, and the switch VLAN database remains consistent. VTP version 3 functions the same on a standalone switch or a stack except when the switch stack is the primary server for the VTP database. In this case, the MAC address of the active switch is used as the primary server ID. If the active switch reloads or is powered off, a new active switch is elected. If you do not configure the persistent MAC address feature, when a new active switch is elected, it sends a takeover message with the new active MAC address as the primary server. If a persistent MAC address is configured, the new active switch waits for the configured timer value. If the previous active switch does not rejoin the stack during this time, then the new active switch issues the takeover message. VTP Configuration Requirements. When you configure VTP, you must configure a trunk port so that the switch can send and receive VTP advertisements to and from other switches in the domain. If you are configuring VTP on a cluster member switch to a VLAN, use the R command privileged exec command to log into the member switch. In VTP versions 1 and 2, when you configure extended range VLANs on a switch, the switch must be in VTP transparent mode. VTP version 3 also supports creating extended range VLANs in client or server mode. VTP versions 1 and 2 do not support private VLANs. VTP version 3 does support private VLANs. If you configure private VLANs, the switch must be in VTP transparent mode. When private VLANs are configured on the switch, do not change the VTP mode from transparent to client or server mode. VTP Settings. The VTP information is saved in the VTP VLAN database. When VTP mode is transparent, the VTP domain name and mode are also saved in the switch running configuration file, and you can save it in the switch startup configuration file by entering copy running config startup config privileged command. You must use this command if you want to save VTP mode as transparent, even if the switch resets. When you save VTP information in the switch startup configuration file and reboot the switch configuration is selected as follows. If the VTP mode is transparent in the startup configuration and the VLAN database and the VTP domain name from the VLAN database matches that in the startup configuration file, the VLAN database is ignored, cleared, and the VTP and VLAN configurations in the startup configuration file are used. The VLAN database revision number remains unchanged in the VLAN database. If the VTP mode or domain name in the startup configuration do not match the VLAN database, the domain name and VTP mode and configuration for VLAN IDs 1 to 1005 use the VLAN database information. Domain names for configuring VTP. When configuring VTP for the first time, you must always assign a domain name. You must configure all switches in the VTP domain with the same domain name. Switches in VTP transparent mode do not exchange VTP messages with other switches, and you do not need to configure a VTP domain name for them. If the NVRAM and DRAM storage is sufficient, all switches in a VTP domain should be in VTP server mode. Do not configure a VTP domain if all switches are operating in VTP client mode. If you configure the domain, it is impossible to make changes to the VLAN configuration of that domain. Make sure that you configure at least one switch in the VTP domain for VTP server mode. Passwords for the VTP domain. You can configure a password for the VTP domain, but it is not required. If you do configure a domain password, all domain switches must share the same password and you must configure the password on each switch in the management domain. Switches without a password or with the wrong password reject VTP advertisements. If you configure a VTP password for a domain, a switch that is booted without a VTP configuration does not accept VTP advertisements until you configure it with the correct password. After the configuration, the switch accepts the next VTP advertisement that uses the same password and domain name in the advertisement. If you are adding a new switch to an existing network with VTP capability, the new switch learns the domain name only after the applicable password has been configured on it. When you configure a VTP domain password, the management domain does not function properly if you do not assign a management domain password to each switch in the domain. Configuring a VTP version 3 password. You can configure a VTP version 3 password on the switch. Enables privileged exec mode. Enters the global configuration mode. Sets the password for the VTP domain. The password can be 8 to 64 characters, hidden. Saves the secret key generated from the password string in the VLAN.date file. If you configure a takeover by configuring a VTP primary server, you are prompted to re-enter the password. Secret directly configures the password. The secret password must contain 32 hexadecimal characters. Returns to privileged exec mode. Verifies your entries. The output appears like this. Configuring a VTP version 3 primary server. When you configure a VTP server as a VTP primary server, the takeover operation starts. Changes the operational state of a switch from a secondary server, the default, to a primary server and advertises the configuration to the domain. If the switch password is configured as hidden, you are prompted to re-enter the password. VLAN selects the VLAN database as the takeover feature. This is the default. MST selects the multiple spanning tree. MST database as the takeover feature. Force overwrites the configuration of any conflicting servers. If you do not enter force, you are prompted for confirmation before the takeover. Configuring VTP on a per port basis. With VTP version 3, you can enable or disable VTP on a per port basis. You can enable VTP only on ports that are in trunk mode. Incoming and outgoing VTP traffic are blocked, not forwarded. Enables privileged exec mode. Enters the global configuration mode. Identifies an interface, and enters interface configuration mode. Enables VTP on the specified port. Returns to privileged exec mode. Verifies the change to the port. Verifies the configuration. Monitoring VTP. This section describes commands used to display and monitor the VTP configuration. You monitor VTP by displaying VTP configuration information, the domain name, the current VTP revision, and the number of VLANs. You can also display statistics about the advertisements sent and received by the switch. Show VTP counters. Displays counters about VTP messages that have been sent and received. Show VTP devices. Conflict. Displays information about all VTP version 3 devices in the domain. Conflicts are VTP version 3 devices with conflicting primary servers. The Show VTP Devices command does not display information when the switch is in transparent or off mode. Show VTP Interface, Interface ID, displays VTP status and configuration for all interfaces or the specified interface. Show VTP Password, displays the VTP password. The form of the password displayed depends on whether or not the hidden keyword was entered and if encryption is enabled on the switch. Show VTP Status, displays the VTP switch configuration information. Configuration examples for VTP. This example shows how to configure a switch as the primary server for the VLAN database, the default, when a hidden or secret password was configured. Before adding a VTP client switch to a VTP domain, always verify that its VTP configuration revision number is lower than the configuration revision number of the other switches in the VTP domain. Switches in a VTP domain always use the VLAN configuration of the switch with the highest VTP configuration revision number. If you add a switch that has a revision number higher than the revision number in the VTP domain, it can erase all VLAN information from the VTP server and VTP domain. VTP pruning still applies only to VLANs 1 to 1005, and VLANs 1002 to 1005 are still reserved and cannot be modified. If the NVRAM and DRAM storage is sufficient, all switches in a VTP domain should be in VTP server mode. Do not configure a VTP domain if all switches are operating in VTP client mode. If you configure the domain, it is impossible to make changes to the VLAN configuration of that domain. Make sure that you configure at least one switch in the VTP domain for VTP server mode. When you configure a VTP domain password, the management domain does not function properly if you do not assign a management domain password to each switch in the domain. For VTP version 1 and 2, before you create extended range VLANs, VLAN ID 1006 to 4094, you must set VTP mode to transparent by using the VTP mode transparent global configuration command. Save this configuration to the startup configuration so that the switch starts in VTP transparent mode. Otherwise, you lose the extended range VLAN configuration if the switch resets and boots up in VTP server mode, the default. If all switches are operating in VTP client mode, do not configure a VTP domain name. If you do, it is impossible to make changes to the VLAN configuration of that domain. Therefore, make sure you configure at least one switch as a VTP server. VTP version 1 and VTP version 2 are not interoperable on switches in the same VTP domain. Do not enable VTP version 2 unless every switch in the VTP domain supports version 2. In VTP version 3, both the primary and secondary servers can exist on an instance in the domain.